Welcome to my World History Notes, where I read from the book that I wrote to teach homeschoolers world history. A Bible believer looks at world history. You can find it on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist bookstore, or just follow me here. It's from the point of view of a Bible believer. So if you're an atheist, Hindu, Muslim, Roman Catholic, other Protestant denominations that sort of don't look at the Bible that way, you might not agree with my conclusions. You might even be offended by my conclusions, but that's okay as long as you have a conclusion that you've developed from study, not just from reading somebody else's opinion or some historical writer or journalist or political demagogue, what they've said. Want you to study. That's what I'm hoping that you'll do. Hear something I say and go, what is that? And look it up, study it, find out about it. So your varying opinions to mine are okay. I'm fine with that as long as you're thinking about world history. So let's begin with the Crusades today. Um, while historians credit Pope Urban II and Raymond of St. Gilles, the Count of Toulouse, with starting the First Crusade to take over the Holy Land from the Muslims for the Church, Roman Catholic Church, popular opinion credits Peter the Hermit. Supposedly, Jesus Christ appeared to him in a dream, giving a letter addressed to the Pope. He took the letter, which he himself obviously wrote, as the real Lord Jesus Christ has never called us to war in the flesh. Look at 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, and read it to the Pope. A holy war was called, the Christian version of the Muslim jihad, a crusade to, quote, deliver Jerusalem from the infidel. So here we have an unregenerate medieval pope answering a demonic vision and a forged letter to attack another group of unregenerate sinners in order to take something from them that belonged to neither, the city of Jerusalem. It is true that the Muslims were in control of the city of David politically, but Jews and Christians of various stripes and persuasions did live there, usually peacefully as well. Peter the Hermit was apparently quite a preacher and very impressive in his behavior and his apparent holiness. He was sent as an ambassador to the Muslims and even impressed them with his piety. He also did the same with the emperor at Constantinople. Like many other wandering preachers of his day who had a large following, and there were many, just as today, celebrity Christians who could mesmerize a crowd with their oratory, even if they were fakes, exhibitionists, or madmen, he was quite popular. His reputation was so great that the idea of a crusade was accepted throughout Europe. Unlike many others loyal to the church, Peter was even on friendly terms with the Jews of France, who sometimes supported his efforts. As Peter's followers, both common knights and soldiers, gathered, they moved eastward, acquiring an unsavory reputation for lawlessness and murderous behavior. Pitched battles broke out in Hungary, and Belgrade had to be evacuated. Finally, after 4 months, the motley, quote, army reached Constantinople, with Peter leading his ragtag band of perhaps 50,000, singing psalms and carrying banners of the cross. Several thousand Jews perished in Germany as anti Semites whipped up the mobs to a frenzy of hatred for the, quote, Christ killers, as they were called. Hunger, accidents, fighting, and disease killed many of his followers, but many more joined them in the lands through which they passed. While what they needed at Constantinople were boats to cross the Bosporus, their, quote, army consisted not only of pious men like Peter the Hermit, but the Jew killer Emich of Leisingen and Volkamar, who had unleashed their soldiers to kill Jews and Christians along the way. There were also honorable men like Walter Saint-Sauveur, the Count of Tübingen, and Walter of Teck, who lent an air of bravery and decency to the Crusaders. The emperor, Alexis Comnenus, received Peter the Hermit and treated him with great respect, but advised him to wait for the arrival of better armed troops. Before long, bands of Crusaders were burning and looting towns around Constantinople itself. The emperor finally gave them their boats just to get rid of what the Greeks called a rabble, told them to keep close to shore, and promised to see them supplied with food. The barons of Europe were to be following with genuine armies, and it was suggested that they wait for them, but Peter insisted on pressing on. Christian villagers were slaughtered along the way, and the emperor's daughter, Anna Comnenus, leaves an account of children being spitted and roasted alive. One group of crusaders did manage to take the Turkish castle of Zaragordon before the Turks slaughtered them to a man. Peter the Hermit was losing control of his army. He went to Constantinople to try to persuade the emperor to provide military protection for his, quote, army. While he was away, a Turkish sultan, Kilij Arslan, attacked the Crusader camp and killed all but about 3,000 people. This effort, today called, quote, the People's Crusade, was now over. Peter the Hermit and the survivors waited now for the arrival of the barons of Catholic Europe. Eventually, several thousand knights under Raymond St. Giles, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Robert of Normandy, along with the counts of Blois and Flanders and Bohemond, arrived. Anno Comnenus estimated that there were 12,000 knights and 70,000 foot soldiers in this army that comprised the true First Crusade. The Europeans referred to all Muslim forces in the Middle East as Turks and Saracens. Excuse me. The Seljuk Turks were a dynasty and part of the larger Oghuz Turks that moved out of Central Asia to be a major force in the Middle East from the 11th to the 14th centuries. The term Saracen, from the Greek word Sarakonoi and the Arabic Sarkian, meaning Easterners, eventually came to be applied to all Arab Muslims. In Catholic writings, it was said to mean those descended from Hagar, not from Sarah, as in Ishmael. The Muslim forces in the Holy Land were not united. This was their great weakness. In the beginning, crusaders from Western Europe and the Greek Empire, still called Rome by the Muslims, being formerly the eastern half of the Roman Empire, worked together with great success. But after the capture of Nicaea, where the Turks insisted on negotiating with the Greek general, considering the king of Rome to be the leader of all Christians, there was a rift. Nicaea once again belonged to Byzantium, and all the European crusaders could do was to move on. The Crusaders had been forced to swear allegiance to the emperor, to pass through his lands, and all did so again for political reasons other than Tancred, Bohemond's nephew. Again, the Greeks and the Latins, as the Europeans were called, agreed to work together. Alexius, the emperor, though, was using this force of what he thought of as barbarians to help him regain the territory his empire had lost to the Muslims. The siege of Antioch lasted for 7.5 months, and in 1098 it was taken. And after that, the Crusaders themselves were besieged in it so that they could not resume their march to Jerusalem until January of 1099. In spite of these setbacks, the morale of the knights was unwavering for the most part, with some exceptions. The effort at this crusade was seen by some as a way to show love and devotion to Jesus Christ and to earn their way to heaven, and by others as an opportunity for glory, riches, and conquest, and by all, perhaps a combination of these things. Once the Crusaders had taken Antioch and the head of the commander Yaghi Sion was presented to them, they were besieged by the relief force under the governor of Mosul, Karboga. The Crusaders were nearly beaten in this siege, but a vision of the lance that pierced Christ's side and the discovery of a piece of metal which a visionary named Peter Bartholomew claimed was the very lance head turned the tide. Even Muslim historians attributed the Crusaders' victory to the discovery of this piece of metal that was used as a holy relic and a sign. Rallying, they left the city and attacked the besieging forces and defeated them. The Muslims generally called the Crusaders Franks, or in Arabic, Ferengi, or the dominant group, the French, for the dominant group, the French. The Germanic tribe that had settled in the area of France centuries before and dominated was the Franks, and the French retained this name during the Crusades. The siege of Jerusalem lasted for a month and a day, after which the Crusaders massacred the inhabitants of what historians consider to be one of the great war crimes of history. There is no explanation for it, as it served no military purpose. Rabid fanaticism, bloodlust, and mob frenzy have all been given as the cause. In any event, on July 15th and 16th of 1099, the Pope's army, and I'm going to quote directly from Oldenburg, quote, scoured the streets and alleys, gardens and courtyards, breaking down doors of houses and mosques, and killing all who fell in their path. No longer the soldiers who had been killed first, but civilians, men, women, children, and old people, unquote. The Jews were shut up in their synagogue, which was then set on fire. The entire Jewish community of Jerusalem died there. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque and surrounding areas, thousands of Muslims were killed. Both Catholic and Muslim historians agree that the entire population was massacred, exterminated, Christian, Jew, and Muslim alike. 40,000 people at least were slaughtered. On a side note, by way of observation from a point of view of being a Bible believer, this is the result of an ecclesiastical organization calling itself a church, attempting to bring in the kingdom of heaven by armed force without the king. Remembering that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. 2 Corinthians 10:4. As one modern preacher, Dr. Peter Ruckman, has put it, quote, kingdom builders are bloody killers. Jerusalem was considered the third holiest city in Islam, next to Mecca and Medina. It was a place where it was believed in Islamic mythology that Muhammad ascended to heaven and from there to visit during a special event in his life called the Miraj. The city was called Al-Quds, or the Holy. The fall of Jerusalem was therefore a great triumph for Roman Catholic Christianity over Islam. It was a symbolic rather than a strategic victory. The two Muslim empires centered at Baghdad and Cairo had viewed Palestine as the frontier dividing them. Half the population was Christian, and the loss of Jerusalem had more of a spiritual importance than a military one. One thing that shocked the Persian and Egyptian centers of Islamic power the most was that, unlike the Greek Christians, the Latin Christians were extremely religious and totally intolerant. Godfrey of Bouillon was elected king of Jerusalem. He was a man of great and noble character and became a legend for his piety and religious devotion. On the other hand, he was a calculating, ambitious, and jealous of his authority. However, this characterization must be viewed from Catholic eyes. From the perspective of the New Testament, it must be remembered that he is given much of the credit for the massacre of Jerusalem as well. He refused the title of king, but accepted a more righteous sounding title of, quote, advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. Over the brief period that the Crusaders ruled a Frankish, kingdom in Syria, many of the knights became Orientalized, some even adopting Eastern dress and traditions. There was a war between Crusader cities and alliance with Muslims. There was war between Crusader cities and alliance with Muslims against other Crusaders and Muslims. The politics were complicated and intertwined. Although the Crusades were a military failure in that the last Frankish kingdoms fell to the Mamelukes, slave soldiers of Egypt, in 1291, they had a lasting effect on European culture and civilization. Literature and popular music were full of tales of this heroic but doomed enterprise for centuries. A great many cultural fashions and scientific advancements entered Europe due to the Crusades. Many notable heroic figures on both sides were created by the Crusades, which still intrigue our collective memories. There was Richard the Lionhearted, King of England, and Saladin, the Kurdish Muslim general, who retook Jerusalem and later signed a peace treaty with King Richard. The Frankish kingdom of Jerusalem itself survived for 88 years and saw 8 kings. One of the greatest was a leper, Baldwin IV, who, if he had not been so ill, it is believed, would have changed history by keeping a firm grip on the holy city against Saladin, the famous Muslim general. It is also believed that the Crusaders had held on to until Saladin's death, 6 months after his treaty with Richard. They would have remained in power for perhaps many more decades before the Ottoman Turks, who I'll discuss later, came to power. There were many attempts at crusades, but 3 important ones. Some of the more pathetic efforts were the First People's Crusade, already mentioned, and the Children's Crusade, a terrible tragedy in itself. In 1212, a shepherd boy near Chartres, France, had a vision in which he insisted that Christ told him to gather all the children of Europe and walk down to the Mediterranean Sea, where God would dry it up like he did the Red Sea for Moses, and, quote, let the children seek for the Holy Cross. An army of 13,000 of these waifs between 8 and 17 years old reached Marseille, France, from the Pyrenees, Brittany, and Germany. Since the sea did not dry up, they went through the Alps to Genoa, Italy, where their number was reduced from 13,000 to about 7,000. In the end, they were deceived into boarding ships for North Africa, where the ones who weren't drowned in shipwrecks were sold in the Muslim world for slaves. The so-called Fourth Crusade, which occurred between 1200 and 1204, merely resulted in Constantinople being sacked and captured. Since Catholics were so in awe of relics, not only did the Crusaders slaughter a great many citizens of the city, they brought back important items such as the head of St. Stephen, a thorn from the crown of thorns that was forced into Christ's head, the Lord's towel, which he girded himself with in John 13, one of John the Baptist's arms, and the finger of Thomas that was thrust into Christ's side, John 20:27. Along with these other phony relics, they stole the head of James the Just, a tear that Christ shed, some of his actual blood that was shed on the cross. Gullible people have been present in all ages. Frederick II led the crusade which spoiled the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The last effort at crusade was under King Louis IX of France, and it too was a monumental flop. The final stand of the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers at Antioch can be found in Harold Lamb's Iron Men and Saints. The Siege of Acre in 1291, the last Catholic stronghold in the Holy Land, is best described in a book called The Flame of Islam. Many thousands of Catholic civilians, men, women, and children, wound up as either slaves or corpses on the way to glory. Like Islam, Latin Roman Catholicism holds the belief that it is destined to conquer the world and that the world is rightfully its possession, promised by God. The rider on the white horse of Revelation 6, which most evangelicals regard as the Antichrist, has traditionally been viewed in Roman Christianity as Christ himself, spreading the gospel over the earth by conquest through the church, although few would put it exactly in those terms after the Reformation. A product of the Crusades were military orders such as the Knights Templar, Knights of St. John, and Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Templar made an interesting topic of independent study themselves, and are the subject of a great many conspiracy theories having to do with the formation of semi-secretive societies such as the Freemasons. However, the Knights Templar were destroyed by King Philip of France in 1307, probably in an attempt to take over the great wealth the order had been from banking and plunder. One story that comes down to us is that their ships, which terrorized the eastern Mediterranean Sea, carried a red cross on the sails, which was called the Pretty Red or Joli Rouge in French. Some writers say that this has come down to us as the pirates' Jolly Roger flag of a skull and crossbones in various forms that struck fear in the hearts of merchant ships so many years later. Who were these knights? The economic and political system of medieval Europe was based on feudalism. This was a system by which the warrior nobility had certain obligations to those above them in their rank as their lord, with a lower rank person, a vassal or servant, all revolving around inheritable land called a fief or a fiefdom. The Knight in History by Francis Guise is an interesting source book on the medieval knight. A knight originally was a person without great status who was raised above the common peasant by his ability to own an expensive suit of armor and a horse. Slowly, he became part of the nobility. Although they remained the lowest rank of upper class, being knighted became prized by nobility and even by royalty themselves. The title of Sir, along with the wearing of plate armor, which we often associate with a knight, came late. Chainmail was the dominant form of personal armor for most of the knight's effective military usefulness. In England, excuse me, in England and America, the appeal of the knight is based mostly on the popularity of the King Arthur legend, which is most famous in its literary representation in such works as Thomas Mallory's 15th century work, Le Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur. Although his works and others are based on this historical Briton warlord who fought against the Germanic invasions of the 5th and 6th century, after that it is pure invention, literary fiction, legend, and myth. Still, the Arthurian legend is a powerful messianic myth in Western literature and is a yardstick by which all concepts of knighthood are measured. Arthur defeated the pagan enemies of his people, died, and will one day return to lead his people again in truth and righteous judgment. This is the essence of the myth. All people are looking for a Messiah, most often the wrong one. Another word that reverberates in the history of the knight is chivalry. This is an ideal more than something that was practiced in fact. Medieval romantics had written about the knight being the sword arm of society, purpose to do right and seek justice, with a tradition going back to the Romans and then further back to the Bible, including King David and Judas Maccabeus as part of the knightly circle. However, it is clear that the concept of knight is a medieval invention. Rome had a class of knights called equites or horsemen, which were originally, excuse me, the cavalry wing of the Roman army and the source of its officers. But during the period of the Republic, they became politicians. This Roman equestrian order has no real connection to the medieval knight except in the mind of some historians and a few romantic novelists. The medieval knight was first and foremost a soldier, as identified from the Latin term for him, miles, and the Anglo-Saxon knight. He was also mounted. He was always mounted. In most languages, the words that replaced the Latin miles denoted horsemen. There's the French chevalier, German ritter, Italian cavaliere, and Spanish caballero. Militarily, the knight was an armored cavalryman devoted to his lord and to the church, which controlled all aspects of society on the surface at least. The knight was a quote soldier of Christ, which meant a soldier of the Roman Catholic Church, an idea put forth first by Pope Gregory VII. Under the church direction and approval, the economic reasons for many landless knights taking part in the Crusades was the prospect of acquiring estates, fiefdoms, if you will, in the East, a pleasing payoff for fighting the enemies of God, or rather his earthly representative, the Pope. If you're under the system where only the oldest son can inherit the property, then the second, third, fourth son has nothing. So going off on a crusade was a great way to hope that you could possibly obtain some wealth and some position. As with the introduction of the stirrup to Europe, the cavalryman became a more effective warrior with the approval and authority of the Pope. His actions became spiritually effective in the church's propagation of the kingdom of heaven, not by the word of God, but by the sharp edge of a sword or the point of a lance. Chivalry was originally a warrior code and was later appropriated by the church to include the duty of protecting and defending it from all comers. The medieval knights were first and foremost the armed wing of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. Our modern romantic notions aside, chivalry might be another topic for your independent study. Next, I'm going to talk about true Christianity. It's very important and it's often ignored. True Christianity during this period. It's fascinating, but you have to look for it. You have to study it. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's a long one today, I know, but I wanted to get through the Crusades, give you a lot to think about, a lot to read, study.